The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm golden glow over the quiet suburb where Andy Williams lived with his son, Robert. Their modest home stood in a serene neighborhood where the lawns were well kept and the sound of birds chirping was a common morning melody. Andy, a tall and broad-shouldered man with an air of quiet confidence, was a single father dedicated to giving his son the best life possible. Andy had always been a man of principle. His life had not been without challenges, but he believed in the power of integrity and hard work. These were the values he instilled in Robert, a bright-eyed boy of 7 who looked up to his father with admiration. Every evening after Andy returned from his job as a community center director, they would sit together at the kitchen table, discussing Robert's day and tackling his homework. This particular morning was special. It was Robert's first day of school, and the excitement was palpable. Andy had laid out Robert's new school uniform the night before, and now the boy stood before him, proudly wearing his neatly pressed shirt and trousers. Robert's backpack, almost as big as he was slung over his shoulder, packed with fresh notebooks and sharpened pencils. "Ready for your big day, champ?" Andy asked, his voice warm and encouraging as they headed towards their car. Robert nodded enthusiastically. "I can't wait, Dad. I wonder if I'll make new friends today. And I want to learn about the solar system." Andy chuckled, ruffling his son's curly hair. "I'm sure you'll make lots of friends. Just be yourself, and remember what we've talked about. Always stand up for what's right, even if it means standing alone." As they drove through the neighborhood, the sun climbed higher, bathing the streets in a brighter light. Andy and Robert continued their conversation, with Robert's curiosity bubbling over about what the school day would hold. They talked about the new subjects Robert would learn, the games he might play during recess, and the importance of being kind and respectful to everyone he met. The car ride was filled with laughter and anticipation, the kind that only a new adventure could bring. Andy glanced at his son in the rearview mirror, his heart swelling with pride and a touch of nervousness. He wanted Robert to have a good start, to feel confident and happy in this new chapter of his life. As they approached an intersection, Andy noticed a police car parked at the side of the road. He thought nothing of it and continued driving. However, just as they crossed the intersection, the police car pulled out and signaled for Andy to stop. The suddenness of the lights flashing in the rearview mirror made his heart skip a beat. Andy Williams sat behind the wheel of his old but reliable sedan, his heart pounding with a mix of confusion and apprehension. Beside him, his son Robert clutched his backpack, his wide eyes reflecting the flashing red and blue lights. Andy took a deep breath and glanced at Robert. "Stay calm, son. Let's see what this is about." A tall, stern-faced officer approached their car. His name tag read Bobby, and his expression was anything but friendly. Andy lowered his window, trying to project an air of calmness he didn't entirely feel. "License and registration," Bobby demanded, his tone curt and devoid of any cordiality. "Good morning, officer," Andy said, keeping his voice steady. He reached into the glove compartment and retrieved the requested documents. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Bobby didn't respond immediately. He examined the documents with a disdainful look, then finally spoke. "Your taillight's out." Andy frowned slightly. He had checked his car just yesterday, and everything had been in perfect working order. "I wasn't aware of that. I'll get it fixed right away." Bobby's eyes narrowed. "Step out of the car." There was a moment of silence as Andy processed the unexpected command. He glanced at Robert, who was looking increasingly frightened. "It's okay, Robert. Just stay here." Andy exited the car, moving slowly and deliberately. He stood beside the vehicle, facing Bobby. "Is there a problem, officer?" Bobby's gaze was cold. "Turn around and place your hands on the hood." Andy hesitated. "Officer, I don't understand." "Do it. Now," Bobby snapped, his hand moving to his baton. Andy complied, feeling the chill of the metal beneath his palms. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. From the corner of his eye, Andy saw the younger officer, Lenny, standing a few feet away, looking uneasy. Lenny seemed to be struggling with something internally, his eyes darting between Andy and Bobby. Bobby began to pat down Andy, his movements rough and invasive. "Do you have any weapons or illegal substances on you?" "No, sir," Andy replied, his voice tight. "I'm just taking my son to school." Bobby didn't seem to be listening. He finished the pat-down and then turned his attention to the car. "I'm going to search your vehicle." Andy's heart skipped a beat. "On what grounds?" Bobby's eyes flashed with irritation. "Just stand there and keep quiet." Andy felt a surge of anger. This wasn't right. He turned slightly, catching Lenny's eye. "Officer, is this necessary? I haven't done anything wrong." Lenny opened his mouth as if to speak, but then seemed to think better of it. He looked down, avoiding Andy's gaze. Bobby began rummaging through the car, throwing items aside carelessly. Robert sat in the back seat, his small body trembling with fear. Andy's heart ached at the sight. "Robert, it's going to be okay," he said, trying to sound reassuring. Bobby's search was thorough and aggressive. He opened the glove compartment, checked under the seats, and even rifled through Robert's backpack. The whole time, Andy stood by helplessly, his anger and frustration growing with each passing second. Andy watched in disbelief as Officer Bobby rummaged through his car. The officer's rough handling of their belongings made Andy's blood boil, but he forced himself to stay calm. He could see Robert's terrified face in the rearview mirror, and he knew he had to be strong for his son. Bobby's search seemed to go on forever. Papers, a spare jacket, and even Robert's lunchbox were tossed aside without care. Andy's heart pounded in his chest. He felt a mix of anger and helplessness, knowing this situation was spiraling out of control. Then Bobby straightened up, holding a small bag of white powder. His eyes were cold and triumphant. "What do we have here?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Andy's mouth went dry. "That's not mine," he exclaimed, taking a step forward. "I've never seen that before in my life." Bobby's sneer deepened. "Sure, that's what they all say. Hands on the hood now." Andy's heart raced as he complied, feeling the cool metal beneath his palms. He turned his head slightly, desperate to make eye contact with the younger officer, Lenny, who stood a few feet away, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Officer Lenny," Andy said, his voice edged with desperation. "You saw him. You saw him plant that bag. This isn't right. Please, help me." Lenny's eyes flicked between Andy and Bobby, uncertainty etched on his face. He looked like he wanted to speak, but was held back by fear and protocol. "Shut up and stay still," Bobby barked, pushing Andy's head down onto the hood. The harsh metal dug into Andy's cheek, but he refused to cry out. He needed to stay composed for Robert, who was now sobbing uncontrollably in the back seat. "Dad, what's happening?" Robert's voice was a mix of confusion and terror, each word cutting into Andy's heart. "Stay calm, Robert. Everything will be okay," Andy said, though he wasn't sure how true those words were. Bobby yanked Andy's arms behind his back, slapping the cold, unforgiving handcuffs onto his wrists. Andy winced at the tightness, but stayed silent, knowing any resistance would only make things worse. "This isn't right, Bobby," Lenny finally said, his voice trembling slightly. "We didn't find anything until you searched the car. This doesn't add up." Bobby shot Lenny a withering look. "You're a rookie. You don't know how these things work. This man is a criminal, and I've just proven it." Andy twisted his head, trying to meet Lenny's gaze. "Please, Lenny, you know this isn't right. You have to believe me." Lenny looked down, his face a mask of conflict. I think we should take him in and sort this out at the station," he said finally, his voice lacking conviction. Bobby scoffed. "That's exactly what we're doing. Now get the kid out of the car and into the cruiser." "No! Don't touch him!" Andy shouted, panic rising in his chest. "Robert, stay where you are! Don't let them take you!" Bobby tightened his grip on Andy's arm. "You're in no position to give orders." Lenny hesitated, then walked over to the car. He opened the door and reached for Robert, who recoiled in fear. "It's okay, kid," Lenny said softly. "We're just going to the station. No one's going to hurt you." Robert's eyes were wide with terror, but he allowed Lenny to help him out of the car. Andy watched helplessly as his son was led to the police cruiser, his heart breaking at the sight. "This is all a misunderstanding," Andy said, his voice cracking. "You have to believe me. I've done nothing wrong." Bobby ignored him, shoving him toward the police car. "Save it for the judge," he muttered. As they drove to the station, Andy's mind raced. He knew he had to stay calm and think clearly. His life and Robert's future depended on it. He glanced at Lenny, who sat silently in the front seat, staring straight ahead. There was a flicker of hope in Andy's heart. If he could just get through to Lenny, maybe there was a chance to set things right. Andy took a deep breath, bracing himself for the battle ahead. This wasn't just about proving his innocence. It was about standing up against a system that was all too willing to judge a man by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. The police station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Lenny sat at his desk, reviewing the day's reports. His mind kept drifting back to the scene on the street where Officer Bobby had aggressively handled Andy Williams. The uneasy feeling in Lenny's gut grew stronger with each passing minute. He had been a cop for only a year, and he had never seen anything like that before. Lenny watched as Bobby paraded Andy through the station, handcuffed and head held high, despite the humiliation. Robert trailed behind, clutching his backpack and looking lost and terrified. The sight made Lenny's stomach churn. Bobby's voice boomed across the room. "Get him into a cell. I'll deal with the paperwork later." Andy turned to his son, his voice calm but firm. "It's going to be okay, Robert. Just stay strong." Bobby shoved Andy forward, muttering something under his breath. Lenny couldn't make out the words, but the tone was enough. He took a deep breath and stood up, his heart pounding. He couldn't let this go on. "Bobby, we need to talk," Lenny said, trying to keep his voice steady. Bobby shot him a look of annoyance. "What is it, rookie? Can't you see I'm busy?" Lenny swallowed hard. "I think we need to reevaluate what just happened. This doesn't feel right." Bobby's eyes narrowed. "What doesn't feel right?" "We caught a criminal. End of story." Lenny's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "The way you handled him—" Bobby stepped closer, his face inches from Lenny's. "Are you questioning my authority?" Lenny's pulse raced. He knew this could cost him his job, but he couldn't stay silent. "I'm saying we need to follow protocol. We should have called it in and waited for backup. And there's the matter of the planted evidence." "Planted evidence?" Bobby hissed, his voice low and dangerous. "Watch your mouth, rookie. You don't know what you're talking about." Lenny took a deep breath, his resolve hardening. "I saw you, Bobby. I saw you plant that bag in his car. This isn't justice." Bobby's face turned a deep shade of red. "You'd better be careful, Lenny. You're treading on thin ice." Just then, a commotion erupted near the holding cells. Lenny turned to see Andy being pinned against the wall by another officer, Bobby's orders clearly still in effect. Andy's face was contorted in pain, struggling to breathe. "Enough!" Lenny shouted, pushing past Bobby and running to the cell. "Let him go!" The officer holding Andy looked up, confused. "What's going on?" Lenny grabbed the officer's arm. "Let him go. Now!" Bobby stormed over, fury in his eyes. "You're making a big mistake, rookie." Lenny didn't flinch. "The only mistake here is what you're doing, Bobby. This man deserves a fair investigation, not a setup." Bobby sneered. "You're done, Lenny. Hand in your badge." Lenny's heart sank, but he didn't waver. He turned to Andy, who was gasping for air but still standing tall. "Are you okay?" Lenny asked. Andy nodded, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and pain. "I'll be fine. Thank you." Lenny took a step back, his decision made. He unpinned his badge and handed it to Bobby. "You're right. I'm done. But not in the way you think." Bobby's face twisted in confusion and rage. "What are you talking about?" Lenny looked him in the eye, unafraid. "I'm reporting this. All of it. You can't keep doing this to people. It ends now." Bobby laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You think anyone's going to believe you over me?" Lenny's jaw tightened. "I have to try. For him and for every other person you've wronged." He turned to Andy. "Let's get you out of here." Lenny's heart pounded as he rushed to Andy's side, helping him to his feet and removing the handcuffs. Andy winced but managed to stand tall, his eyes filled with a determined fire. Lenny glanced nervously at Bobby, who stood fuming a few steps away, his face twisted in rage. "What do you think you're doing, Lenny?" Bobby spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You're betraying your own." Lenny took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "I'm doing what's right. This man hasn't done anything wrong, and you know it." Bobby's eyes narrowed, his fists clenching. "You're making a huge mistake. You're just a rookie. You don't understand how things work around here." Andy, now free from the cuffs, took a step forward. "I think it's you who doesn't understand, Officer Bobby." Bobby turned to Andy, his expression shifting from anger to confusion. "What are you talking about?" Andy reached into his pocket and pulled out a badge, holding it up for everyone to see. "I'm Andy Williams, the new police captain of this precinct." A stunned silence fell over the room. Bobby's face went pale, and he took a step back, his eyes widening in disbelief. "No, that's not possible." "It's very possible," Andy replied, his voice steady and authoritative, "and I've seen enough today to know that changes need to be made." Bobby's shock quickly turned to desperation. "This is a misunderstanding. I was just doing my job. You don't understand what it's like out there." Andy's gaze hardened. "I understand perfectly, and I know that what you did today was not justifiable by any means. You abused your power and it ends now." Bobby shook his head, a look of panic crossing his face. "You can't do this. You need me. This place will fall apart without me." "I think it will be better off," Andy said calmly. "Hand over your badge and gun, Officer Bobby. You're relieved of your duties." Bobby stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. Lenny stepped forward, his voice firm but calm. "You heard the captain. Hand them over." Bobby's eyes darted around the room, looking for support, but he found none. Slowly he reached for his badge and gun, his hands shaking. He handed them to Lenny, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. "This isn't over," Bobby muttered, his voice low and threatening. "You'll regret this." Andy stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Bobby's. "The only thing I regret is that this went on for as long as it did. Now, Leave this station. You're done here." Bobby's shoulders slumped as he turned and walked out, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. The room was silent for a moment, the tension slowly dissipating. Lenny turned to Andy, his voice filled with a mix of relief and respect. "Thank you, Captain. I wasn't sure what to do, but I knew I couldn't let him get away with it." Andy placed a hand on Lenny's shoulder. "You did the right thing, Lenny. It takes courage to stand up for what's right, especially when it means going against your own. I'm proud of you." Lenny nodded, feeling a sense of validation and purpose he hadn't felt before. "What happens now?" "Now," Andy said, his voice strong and resolute, "we start rebuilding. We make sure that this precinct becomes a place where justice and integrity are upheld. And we make sure that people like Bobby are held accountable for their actions." Lenny felt a renewed sense of hope. "I'm with you, Captain, whatever it takes." Andy smiled, a sense of determination and optimism radiating from him. "We're going to need all the help we can get, but I have faith that we can make this right." Andy sat at his new desk in the captain's office, the weight of his responsibilities pressing heavily on his shoulders. The events of the past few days had left the precinct in turmoil, but he knew he couldn't stop at Bobby's dismissal. There was a deeper rot within the department, and he was determined to root it out. Lenny knocked on the open door, stepping inside with a determined look. "Captain, I've got the files you asked for. It's not pretty." Andy nodded, gesturing for Lenny to sit. "Let's see what we're dealing with." Lenny handed over a thick stack of files. "These are reports of incidents where Bobby was involved. Complaints, use of force reports, suspicious arrests, there's a lot." Andy flipped through the files, his expression growing grimmer with each page. "This is worse than I thought. How did this go unnoticed for so long?" "People were afraid to speak up," Lenny replied, his voice low. "Bobby had a way of intimidating anyone who questioned him, and those who did try to report him, well, their complaints seemed to disappear." Andy sent the files down, taking a deep breath. "We need to gather more evidence. If Bobby was this corrupt, he wasn't acting alone. We have to find out who else is involved." Lenny nodded. "I've been thinking the same thing. We should start by talking to some of the officers who worked closely with him. Maybe they'll open up now that he's gone." Andy agreed. "And we need to reach out to the community. There are probably more victims out there who never came forward because they didn't think anyone would listen." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Andy and Lenny worked tirelessly, interviewing officers and community members, piecing together the extent of Bobby's misconduct. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that Bobby had been part of a larger network of corruption. One afternoon, Andy and Lenny sat in a small, dimly lit room, speaking with an officer named Rodriguez. He had been on the force for years and had seen more than his fair share of questionable behavior. "I never liked the way Bobby operated," Rodriguez admitted, his eyes downcast. "But whenever I tried to bring it up, I got shut down. I have a family to think about, you know?" Andy leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "I understand, Rodriguez, but things are different now. We need your help to clean up this department. We need to know everything you know." Rodriguez hesitated, then sighed heavily. "All right. There were times when Bobby would tell us to turn a blind eye to certain activities. He'd make sure certain people were protected and others were targeted. It was all about power and control." Lenny scribbled notes furiously while Andy absorbed every word. "Can you give us names, dates, anything that can help us build a case?" Rodriguez nodded slowly. "I'll do what I can, but you have to be careful. There are still people here who are loyal to Bobby. They won't take kindly to this investigation. Andy's eyes hardened. We're not backing down. This has to stop. As the investigation progressed, the threats began. Anonymous phone calls, notes left on cars, even veiled warnings from fellow officers. Andy and Lenny knew they were treading dangerous ground, but their resolve only strengthened. One evening, as Andy was leaving the precinct, he found a note taped to his car windshield. It read, "Back off, or you'll regret it." He showed the note to Lenny the next morning. "They're trying to scare us." Lenny's jaw tightened. "It's not going to work. We're too close to the truth." Andy nodded, his determination unwavering. "We have to stay vigilant, and we need to keep pushing forward. The people who depend on us deserve a police force they can trust." The final breakthrough came when a former officer who had left the force after clashing with Bobby came forward with damning evidence. He had kept records of the corrupt activities, knowing that one day the truth would come out. With this new evidence, Andy and Lenny were able to make several arrests, bringing down the network of corruption that had plagued the department for years. It wasn't an easy battle, and it wasn't without its casualties, but justice was finally being served. As the dust settled, Andy stood in front of his officers, addressing them with pride and hope. "We've been through a lot, but we're coming out stronger. This precinct will be a place of integrity and justice. We owe it to ourselves and to the community we serve." Lenny stood beside him, ready to continue the fight for a better future. The precinct buzzed with an unfamiliar energy. The investigation into Bobby's misconduct had opened a floodgate of revelations. Andy and Lenny found themselves at the center of a growing storm as former victims of Bobby's corruption began to come forward, their voices rising in a chorus, demanding justice. Andy stood in the community center's crowded hall, facing a sea of faces marked by anger, pain, and hope. He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice steady and clear. "Thank you all for coming. I know many of you have suffered in silence for far too long. Today, we're here to change that. We will listen, we will document, and we will fight for the justice you deserve." From the back of the room, an elderly woman raised her hand. "Captain Williams, my grandson was arrested last year on false charges. Bobby planted drugs on him. We didn't have the means to fight back." Andy nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of their stories. "I'm deeply sorry for what your family has endured. We will review every case and ensure those responsible are held accountable." Lenny, standing beside Andy, felt the enormity of the task ahead. "Please, if any of you have evidence, statements, or anything that can help us build our case, step forward. We need your support to make this right." One by one, people shared their stories. Each testimony added to the mounting evidence against Bobby and his network. Andy and Lenny worked tirelessly, often late into the night, compiling records, interviewing witnesses, and seeking support from civil rights organizations. The local media soon picked up the story, and the public outcry grew louder. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, their signs and chants demanding justice and an end to police corruption. The pressure was palpable, and Andy knew they were making powerful enemies. One evening, Andy sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of files and evidence. Lenny walked in, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Thought you could use a break," Lenny said, handing Andy a cup. Andy took a sip, savoring the warmth. "Thanks, Lenny. We're making progress, but it feels like an uphill battle." Lenny's eyes hardened with determination. "We won't lose, Captain. We've already exposed Bobby. Now we need to keep pushing. We have the truth on our side." Their resolve was tested daily. Threats came from within the department and from unknown sources. Andy's car tires were slashed, and he received anonymous letters warning him to drop the investigation. Lenny found a dead rat in his locker, a chilling reminder of the stakes involved. But they pressed on, their determination fueled by the stories of those who had suffered. They formed alliances with local advocacy groups and civil rights lawyers, creating a united front against the corruption they were fighting to dismantle. One day, as Andy reviewed a particularly damning piece of evidence, Lenny burst into the office. "Captain, you need to see this." Andy followed Lenny to the main room, where a television played a live news broadcast. The mayor stood at a podium, flanked by other city officials. "In light of the recent revelations and ongoing investigation, I am appointing an independent oversight committee to review all cases handled by Officer Bobby and his associates. We are committed to transparency and justice." The room erupted in cheers and applause. Andy felt a surge of hope. This was a significant victory, but he knew the fight was far from over. The real work was just beginning. Later that evening, as the precinct quieted down, Andy and Lenny sat together, reflecting on the day's events. "We've made it this far, Lenny. We can't stop now," Andy said, his voice filled with determination. As they continued their work, the community's support grew stronger. People who had once been afraid to speak out now felt empowered. The wave of protest that had started with a few brave voices now surged through the city, unstoppable and relentless. Andy knew there would be more battles ahead, but with each victory they were one step closer to creating a better, fairer world. The investigation had been long and grueling, stretching over several months. Andy and Lenny had faced threats, resistance, and endless nights of sifting through evidence. But now the day had finally arrived. The truth was ready to be unveiled, and justice was within reach. Andy stood in the precinct's briefing room, addressing his team. The air was thick with anticipation. "Today, we bring the evidence we've gathered to light. We've worked tirelessly to expose the corruption that has tainted our department. It's time to hold those responsible accountable." Lenny nodded, his face set with determination. "We've got everything we need. Witnesses, documents, recordings. Bobby and his associates won't escape this time." The room was filled with a mix of emotions: relief, anxiety, and a cautious hope. They had come a long way, but this was the moment that would determine if their efforts would truly pay off. Andy turned to Lenny. "It's time. Let's do this." They made their way to the city courthouse, where a press conference had been arranged. The media had been following the investigation closely, and the public demand for transparency and justice had reached a fever pitch. Andy knew that today was not just about punishing the guilty, but also about restoring faith in the system. As they stepped up to the podium, the crowd hushed. Andy took a deep breath and began. "Over the past several months, we have conducted an exhaustive investigation into the corrupt practices within our police department. Today, we present our findings." He outlined the evidence in meticulous detail, presenting a damning case against Bobby and his network. Lenny followed, sharing testimonies from victims and witnesses, each one painting a clearer picture of the abuse and corruption that had festered for years. Bobby, standing at the back of the room, could no longer hide his fear and anger. His face was a mask of disbelief and defiance. As the evidence piled up, his bravado began to crumble. "And now," Andy said, his voice unwavering, "we will ensure that justice is served." At his signal, officers moved to arrest Bobby and his cohorts. The once powerful man was now just another criminal being led away in handcuffs. The crowd erupted in a mix of applause and shouts for justice. It was a moment of catharsis for a community that had suffered too long. Back at the precinct, the mood was one of cautious optimism. Andy gathered his team once more. "We've taken a significant step today, but our work is far from over. We need to ensure that this never happens again. We must rebuild trust and prove that we are worthy of the community's faith." Lenny spoke up, his voice resolute. "We need to implement stricter oversight, better training, and create a culture of accountability. It won't be easy, but it's necessary." Andy nodded. "Agreed. We'll start with a review of our policies and procedures. We'll work with community leaders to foster an environment of transparency and cooperation." The coming weeks were filled with intensive efforts to reform the department. Andy and Lenny met with civil rights organizations, community groups, and city officials. They organized town hall meetings to hear directly from the citizens they served. The goal was clear: to rebuild a police force that protected and served with integrity and respect. One evening, as Andy was preparing to leave the office, Lenny knocked on the door. "Got a minute, Captain?" Andy looked up, smiling. "Of course. What's on your mind?" Lenny sat down, his expression thoughtful. "I just wanted to say thank you for believing in this, in us. It's been a tough journey, but I think we're making real progress." Andy leaned back, his eyes reflecting the weight of their shared experiences. "It's not over yet, but we're getting there. We've got a good team, and we're doing the right thing. That's what matters." Lenny nodded. "Yeah, it is, and it's good to know we're not alone in this." As they walked out of the precinct, the evening air was cool and refreshing. The city was beginning to heal, and so were they. Andy looked at the stars, feeling a rare sense of peace. With each step they took, Andy and Lenny knew they were part of something bigger than themselves, a movement towards a just and equitable future. Andy Williams and his son Robert walked up the path to their house, the evening sun casting long shadows on the ground. The weight of the recent weeks felt lighter now, replaced by a sense of accomplishment and hope. They had faced tremendous challenges and come out stronger. As they entered their home, Andy placed a reassuring hand on Robert's shoulder. "How are you feeling, buddy?" Robert looked up at his father, his eyes reflecting a newfound understanding and respect. "I'm okay, Dad. I'm just glad you're home." Andy smiled, feeling a deep pride in his son. "Me too, Robert. Me too." They settled into their evening routine, the house slowly filling with the comforting sounds of everyday life. Andy moved to the kitchen, preparing a simple dinner while Robert set the table. The normalcy of it all felt like a balm to their weary souls. "Dad," Robert said, breaking the silence, "why did you do it? Why did you go through all that trouble?" Andy paused, considering his words carefully. "Because it was the right thing to do. Sometimes standing up for what's right isn't easy, but it's necessary. Integrity and courage are values we must hold on to, no matter the cost." Robert nodded, absorbing the lesson. "Will things be better now?" Andy looked at his son, seeing the hope and curiosity in his eyes. "Yes, they will. It might take time, but every step we take towards justice makes a difference." After dinner, they sat together on the couch, Andy's arm around Robert. They watched a movie, but Andy's mind was partially elsewhere, reflecting on the journey they had been through. He thought about Lenny and the battles they had fought together. The next morning, Andy returned to the precinct with a renewed sense of purpose. The atmosphere had shifted noticeably. Officers greeted him with respect, a stark contrast to the hostility he had first encountered. Lenny approached Andy's office, knocking lightly on the door. "Morning, Captain. We have a meeting with the community leaders today." Andy nodded, grateful for Lenny's unwavering support. "Thanks, Lenny. Let's make sure they know we're committed to real change. The meeting was held in a local community centre, a modest building that had seen its share of town meetings and social gatherings. As Andy and Lenny entered, they were met with a mix of apprehension and hope from the community members. After the meeting, Lenny turned to Andy, a hint of a smile on his face. "We're getting there, Captain, one step at a time." Andy nodded, feeling a sense of camaraderie and shared mission. "We are, and we won't stop until we've made this precinct something we can all be proud of." That evening, as Andy and Robert sat on their porch, enjoying the cool night air, Robert turned to his father. "Dad, do you think I can be brave like you one day?" Andy looked at his son, seeing the potential and strength within him. "Robert, you already are brave. Standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, is the bravest thing anyone can do." Robert smiled, a determined look in his eyes. "I'll remember that." Andy hugged his son tightly, the warmth of the embrace a reminder of what they had achieved and what they would continue to fight for. Integrity and courage were not just words, they were the principles that guided their lives. And as long as they held on to those values, they could face any challenge that came their way. Hey everyone, thanks for watching our latest story. I hope you found it as powerful and inspiring as we did. Andy and Robert's journey reminds us all about the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it's tough. It's a story of courage, integrity, and the impact one person can have on their community. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends and family. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an update from our channel. We've got plenty more stories that will inspire and motivate you to make a difference in your own life. Thank you for being a part of our amazing community. Together, we can spread positivity and encourage each other to always stand up for justice. Stay strong, stay positive, and we'll see you in the next video. Take care, everyone.